Based on what I'm seeing here, we have a few things to figure out. Guten Yardening, everybody! About 2.5 months ago, we brought this Chicago hardy fig into our family of fruit trees. And today I'm going to answer questions that you might have about growing a fig just like this. When this fig first arrived about 70 days ago, it looked like a little tiny twig. In fact, when these are in their dormant state, they look as though there's no life at all to them. But that's pretty typical of a lot of fruit trees. In the fall, in the autumn, they start to drop their leaves and they go into that nice dormant state. The reason why, after about 1.5 months indoors, this broke free from its dormant state is because we had it in temperatures that are nice and warm and plenty of light. That means that it's actually come out of its dormant state a little bit early, so we have to really make sure we're taking care of our potted plant now. Now, the first thing I want to address is dormancy. And I think that's a pretty important concept, especially if you're trying to grow here as far north as Zone 5. As the autumn temperatures approach and the leaves start to fall, it starts to head into that state of dormancy. And if the temperatures outside reach 10 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, you have to make sure that this plant is brought indoors. Now, it does not need to come indoors into a space like this where it's nice and warm and nice and bright. It can actually go indoors in an unheated garage or another area of your house that's unheated but protected somewhat from that frost. If we had planted this in the ground instead of kept it in a pot, we could have kept it outdoors as long as the temperature stayed above about -10 degrees Fahrenheit. And we could have covered it in mulch. It really likes a nice mulch layering. However, our temperatures here still tend to dip below that -10 degrees Fahrenheit as well, especially in recent years, and so we didn't want to risk it. Instead, we brought it indoors, and now we have the beginning development of our fig. Now that brings us to our second point, which is how we should pot this. When it first arrived, it came in a smaller temporary pot that we needed to get it out of right away and pot upwards. And so we started with this 1-gallon pot, and we're going to continue to move it up as the roots develop and as the plant continues to mature. If we had over-potted it, that would lead to a different kind of stress on the roots. And if we kept it in too small a container, well, you've seen root-bound plants before, and they just don't develop well. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the growth of this fig with bigger and bigger pots. Now, when you're growing in containers, the size of the fig tree is determined by the pot size. And so that's one way to limit the size, the scale of the fig that you're growing. And that leads us to the third question, which is just how big will a Chicago hardy fig get? Well, from what we've read, it will grow as tall as 10 to 15 feet, though most commonly it's about 8 to 12 feet in height and about 6 to 8 or 6 to 10 feet in diameter. Well, we can't possibly have that and still move it indoors and outdoors. And so when we increase pot size, what we're going to do is keep it to a size where we're only going to get maybe about 4 to 7 feet in height and probably about 4 to 5 feet in width. Now, it is possible we could keep increasing this potting size all the way up to, say, a half a whiskey barrel. But if we did that, what we would find is that our plant would grow much bigger than what we want. And with the size of the container, the weight of the container, the weight of the soil and the tree, it would be very hard to move around. So that's something we're going to avoid. If you did decide to go in that direction, one of the things we've seen recommended is that you put the pot on wheels in some way. So whether that's some sort of garden dolly or whatever would work for you. Now again, we're talking about here in Zone 5 where we need to bring it indoors for our sake here in our location. If you're in one of the warmer zones, and this is hardy from Zones 5 to 10, if you're in one of those warmer zones, that might not be something you need to worry about as much. Now, when it comes to speed of growth, a fig like this can grow upwards of 2 to 3 feet per year until it gets to that size of maturity. But again, and I'm going to repeat this because I think it's so important to remember, the size can be in part controlled by the size of the pot. And so yes, you're going to see this growth. This is probably about 8 inches of growth that we've seen already here on this fig in the last 1.5 months. So if we kept it in this same container, we wouldn't see 7 or 8 more feet. We'd be able to limit some of that growth if we wanted to. Now, in terms of the soil that we have here for this plant, the pH of this soil is about 6.5 according to my last test. And like a lot of other of our fruit trees, you want to have a slightly acidic soil, somewhere in that 5.5 to 6.5 range. So this 6.5 pH is about as high as you'd want to get for this fig. And the potting mix that we have in here is our standard inert potting mix with the Coco Coir and some peat moss and some vermiculite. So what we have is some really nice drainage, and we also have some good moisture retention. And in the bottom of this pot, and this is really important whenever you're putting these in pots, we have plenty of nice holes in here for drainage. We don't want to keep the water clustered around the roots, or that'll create another issue that we don't want to have to deal with. Now, one of the other questions that we've seen a lot of is whether or not this should be grown indoors year-round. And from a personal perspective, I think that's not the best idea, especially given that this plant does best when it receives full sunlight. And in this case, a minimum, and I'll repeat that, a minimum of 8 hours. Yes, you can grow it in partial sun, but ideally, it prefers that 8+ hours at the height of its growing season. Now, that being said, if you grow it indoors, you're going to lose some of that light. You're going to lose some of that nice warmth that you'd have outside in the summer months. And so ideally what you would do is take this out once the temperatures start to warm back up. Give it a little bit of time to adjust to those warmer temperatures as you move it out. It's kind of like hardening off a plant. You don't want to shock this system by just going from cold to hot. Especially if you've been storing it in your garage, it'll have a nice little bit of time to adjust as temperatures start to rise. You just don't want to throw it right into the sun right away. You give it a little time to adjust, and it will love you for bringing it outdoors during those warm months. One of the things that led us to purchasing this Chicago Hardy fig is also the timeliness of fruit production. When we looked at how long this takes to produce fruit versus a lot of our other fruit trees, it's actually supposed to be a little bit faster. We've even seen where you can get fruit within the first year, though more likely most people suggest that we get fruit by the second year for sure. But one of the cool things about the fig that is so different from a lot of our other fruit trees, like our apple, like our Meyer lemon, or our tangerine, where they have these beautiful blooms that pop up that smell so good and then they fall off and you see the fruit there. The blossoms for the fig occur inside of the figs themselves. So we're not going to be able to look around and see all these blossoms popping up everywhere. That's not how this one grows. Another question you might have is just how are these figs going to taste once they do start to develop? Well, I've never actually had a fig fresh off the tree. But what I've read about the Chicago Hardy fig is that they tend to be smaller figs, so not as large as some of the other varieties, and that they taste, and I quote, sweeter than honey. Now, I have had figs and I do enjoy them. I just haven't had them fresh off the tree. And so you can imagine how excited if I hear this is going to taste sweeter than honey, I might be about the fruit that's going to develop off this in the next year to 2 years plus. The last thing I want to talk to you about are some of the diseases that typically impact these figs, because there are some fungal diseases, some viral diseases as well. Some of them spread by a type of mite that can impact the development of these plants. I think the thing that we're going to have to keep an eye out for the most in this area is a form of mold that sometimes causes rot in the fruit, especially as they over ripen. So as we see fruits develop, we're going to keep a close eye when they ripen. We'll get them off the plant right away. We're also going to make sure we don't overwater this plant. We don't want to create an environment that's going to be conducive to any of that fungal situation. And if we see any problems, we're going to be sure to diagnose them right away. As exciting as growing something new, growing something for the first time is, it can also be that heartbreaking if something goes wrong, if there's some sort of infection or some sort of issue with the growth. So we just need to keep a close eye on this plant to make sure it stays as healthy as we can keep it. We are so excited for the development we're seeing already in this fig, and I am confident as summer rolls around and as we head through the next few months, we're going to see even more growth and have a whole lot more to share. You know what? I can't wait until we see the first signs of fruit on this fig. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.